The last click of an empty magazine was the loudest sound in the forest. It echoed in Sergeant Marcus Thorne's ears, a metallic punctuation mark at the end of a very bad sentence. He dropped the useless piece of steel and pressed his back harder. Against the rough bark of the pine tree, the scent of sap and sweat filling his nostrils. Below him, in the tangled undergrowth of the Colorado Rockies, the rest of SEAL Team Trident were in the same predicament. 6 men, the best of the best, were now reduced to using their rifles as clubs. They were out of grenades, out of 7.62 rounds, and nearly out of time. The enemy, a disciplined and unnervingly quiet group of domestic militants calling themselves the First Sons, were closing in. They moved with the patience of hunters who knew their prey was already caught in the snare. Trident Actual to command, Marcus whispered into his comms, his voice raspy. We are Winchester on all primaries. I repeat, we are out of ammunition. The package is secure, but we are being systematically boxed in. We need immediate air support. Danger close. The static on the other end felt heavy, suffocating. Every second of silence was a lifetime. They were protecting a civilian asset, a cryptographer named Dr. Aries Thorne who had stumbled upon the First Son's communication network and was now the only person who could break their encryption. He was huddled behind a moss-covered boulder. His face pale, his city clothes torn and muddy. He was brave. Marcus had to give him that, but bravery didn't stop bullets. Finally, a voice crackled back, distant and clinical. Trident Actual, this is command. Air assets are being evaluated. The terrain is problematic. Stand by. Marcus wanted to scream. Problematic? They were in a steep, densely wooded ravine. An F-35 or an F-16 would have to scream overhead at 400 knots, unable to distinguish a SEAL from a militant under the thick canopy. They'd be dropping bombs on a prayer. There was only one aircraft in the entire US inventory that could do this job, a plane designed to fly low and slow, to dance between the trees and deliver precise, devastating fire. But Marcus knew, with a sinking feeling in his gut, that the pilot who flew that plane was probably shuffling papers somewhere, a ghost haunting the halls of Peterson Air Force Base Point 200 miles away. Captain Eva Rostova stared at that same problematic terrain on a satellite feed, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of a cold, steel desk. The air in the windowless intelligence room was stale, smelling of lukewarm coffee and ozone from the humming servers. For 2 years, this had been her world. Not the limitless blue of the sky, but the flat, pixelated green of a monitor. Her job was to analyze flight data, to write after-action reports on missions flown by other pilots. Pilots who flew sleek, billion-dollar jets that looked impressive at airshows but were next to useless in a knife fight in a forest. Look at that cloud cover, a voice drawled behind her. Major Kyle Viper Jensen, a pilot with more swagger than flight hours, leaned over her shoulder, pointing a cocky finger at the screen. Can't get a laser designation through that. And the ROE is tight. No go for the F-35s. They'll have to send in a chopper, and that's a turkey shoot for whatever these yahoos have down there. Eva didn't turn. She could feel the smirk in his voice. He was one of the new breed, a pilot who believed that warfare was a video game played from 30,000 feet. He and his friends called her Grounded Goose, a cruel little joke that followed her down the hallways. They saw her as a relic, just like the A-10 Warthog she used to fly. A plane they called the Flying Brick, too slow, too ugly for modern warfare. They didn't understand. They didn't know what that brick could do. They hadn't seen it chew through enemy armor like a rabid dog or hold its ground over a firefight, a guardian angel with a cannon that fired shells the size of milk bottles. They don't need a laser, Eva said, her voice quiet but firm. They need a pilot who can read the ground, not a screen. Jensen chuckled. Yeah, well, good luck finding one of those. All the old-timers are retired or, well, you know. He let the word hang in the air, the unspoken accusation that had defined her life for the past 24 months. The Kandahar incident. The mission where everything went wrong, where a split-second decision, the right decision she knew in. Her soul was twisted into a fatal error by a board of inquiry. They'd stripped her of her wings, not officially, but with 1,000 paper cuts, grounding her indefinitely pending further review. The door to the briefing room hissed open, and Colonel Miller strode in, his face a mask of grim authority. He was a man who saw the world in black and white, in regulations and acceptable losses. He had been the lead investigator on her case. He looked at the tactical display, then at the faces in the room. The SEALs are pinned down, he said, his voice cutting through the low hum of the servers. They're out of ammo, and the hostiles are closing the net. The President has authorized any and all necessary force, but the rules of engagement on the ground are specific. We cannot risk the asset. We need surgical fire, and we need it 10 minutes ago. Jensen puffed out his chest. Sir, Viper and Lancer are on standby. We can do a high-speed pass, drop some noise, try to scatter them. And risk hitting the SEALs or the asset. Miller shot back, his eyes like chips of ice. Not an option. The canopy is too thick. We can't get a clear visual. Eva stood up. The movement was small, but it drew every eye in the room. The silence was deafening. She felt a dozen pairs of eyes on her, judging, remembering. She met Colonel Miller's gaze directly, her heart pounding a steady, defiant rhythm against her ribs. Sir, she began, her voice unwavering. Bay 14. The 78-0615. She's fully loaded. High explosive incendiary in the GAU-8. Maverick. Missiles on the pylons. She's been sitting there for a year, but my crew chief keeps her ready. She can do this. Miller's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, annoyance, maybe even pity, crossed his face. Captain Rostova, you are not on flight status. With all due respect, sir, flight status is a matter of paperwork. Skill is a matter of fact. I've flown that exact ravine on a training exercise. I know every turn, every thermal updraft. I can tell the difference between a muzzle flash from an M4 and an AK-47 from 1,000 feet, through the trees. No other pilot on this base can say that. Jensen let out a short, derisive laugh. Come on, Colonel. You're not seriously considering this. Her plane is an antique, and, he trailed off, but his meaning was clear. And so is she. The insult stung, but Eva didn't flinch. She kept her eyes locked on Miller. This wasn't about pride. It was about the 6 men on that mountain who were about to die. It was about the promise every soldier makes to another, to never leave them behind. She had been forced to leave her own honor behind in that hearing room 2 years ago. She wouldn't let it happen to them. Colonel, she pressed, stepping forward. Those men don't have time for you to find a perfect solution. They need the only solution. They need a Warthog. And I'm the only pilot qualified to fly it. Let me go. Miller's jaw tightened. He looked from Eva's determined face to the tactical map, where the red icons of the first suns were now almost on top of the blue icon representing Trident Team. He was a man trapped by his own regulations. To trust her was to risk his career. To admit that the board he led might have been wrong. To deny her was to sign the death warrants of 6 American heroes. He took a deep breath, the air crackling with tension. Captain, he said, his voice cold and final. Your request is denied. You are a liability. The last thing those men need is another Valkyrie incident on their hands. Now return to your station. That's an order. The words hit her like a physical blow. A liability. He had used her call sign, Valkyrie, like a curse. The name she had earned, the name that once meant she was the one who decided who lived and who died on the battlefield, was now just a synonym for disaster. She felt the blood drain from her face, the hope she had allowed to flicker within her extinguished in an instant. The room was silent, the only sound the frantic, unheard screams of 6 men fighting for their lives in a forest 200 miles away. Eva stood frozen for a moment, the colonel's dismissal echoing in her ears. She could feel Jensen's smug gaze on her back. She could accept the mockery, the whispers, the desk job. But she could not accept this. She could not sit here and listen to those men die because of a grudge and a flawed report. She turned, not back to her desk, but toward the door. Every head in the room followed her. Miller's eyes narrowed. Captain, where do you think you're going? Eva paused at the door, her hand on the handle, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. If she saw the judgment in their eyes one more time, she might hesitate. You're right, Colonel, she said, her voice dangerously calm. You denied my request. She took a breath, the stale air of the room feeling electric. So I'm going to go make a different one. Before he could respond, she was out the door, her boots echoing down the empty corridor. She wasn't walking, she was marching. Marching toward the one place on the base where regulations were just suggestions, where the only thing that mattered was the mission. She was heading for the flight line dot on the mountain. Marcus Thorne heard the snap of a twig just a few feet away. He risked a glance around the tree. A figure in dark camouflage was low crawling toward him, his face painted, his eyes cold and empty. It was over. He gripped his knife, ready to sell his life for a few more seconds for the doctor behind him. He keyed his MIC one last time, a final message to a world that couldn't help them. Command, this is Trident Actual. Hostiles are in the wire. We are being overrun. He paused, listening to the rustle of leaves as more militants moved into position. He could see the barrels of their rifles poking through the ferns. This is Trident Actual, signing off. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of the end. But then, a new sound began to filter through the trees. It was faint at first, a low, guttural hum that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't the high-pitched scream of a fighter jet. It was something deeper, angrier. A sound that made the hairs on Marcus's arms stand on end. It was a roar, and it was getting closer. The roar grew, a sound that didn't belong in the pristine quiet of the Rocky Mountains. It was a hungry, mechanical growl that vibrated through the soles of Marcus Thorne's boots. The First Sons militants, who had been moving with such predatory confidence, froze. Their heads tilted up, their eyes scanning the thick grey sky, searching for the source of the noise. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated menace, and it gave Marcus a sliver of hope so sharp it almost hurt. He knew that sound. Every soldier who had ever been pinned down in a godforsaken corner of the world knew that sound. It was the brutish, beautiful song of the A-10 Thunderbolt II. It was the sound of the Warthog, back at Peterson Air Force Base. Eva was a whirlwind of controlled fury. She didn't go to the flight line, not yet. That would be too direct, too easy for Miller to stop. Instead, she went to her own office, a small, cluttered space that smelled of old paper and regret. She bypassed her computer, heading straight for a locked filing cabinet in the corner. Inside, beneath stacks of redacted mission files, was her salvation, a thick binder labeled A-10 Fleet Airworthiness Directives and Operational Waivers. For 2 years, while pilots like Jensen were practicing high-altitude acrobatics, Eva had been studying. She'd read every tedious line of every regulation, not because she had to, but because she was looking for a crack in the system, a loophole, a way back into the sky. And she had found 1. Section 4, Paragraph 7b, the warfighter's prerogative. An obscure, almost forgotten clause from the Cold War era, written for pilots who might find themselves behind enemy lines. It stated that in the event of a complete breakdown of the command structure or an imminent and catastrophic loss of American lives, a pilot with a current, albeit non-active, flight qualification could commandeer an available aircraft with the verbal authorization of a 2-star general or higher. It was a relic, a legal long shot, but it was all she had. Her hands flew across a desk, pulling up the direct satellite line to NORAD Command, deep within Cheyenne Mountain. She knew General Thompson, the commanding officer, was a gruff, no-nonsense Air Force lifer who had started his career flying F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam. He was a man who understood what it meant to be in the mud. He wouldn't care about the politics of her grounding. He would care about the men on that mountain. As the encrypted line connected, she heard footsteps pounding down the hall. Colonel. Miller burst into her office, his face flushed with anger. Rostova, what in the hell do you think you're doing? I gave you a direct order. Eva held up a single finger, her eyes fixed on the screen as the call connected. General Thompson, this is Captain Eva Rostova at Peterson. The general's face appeared on the screen, his expression stern. Captain, this is a restricted channel. This had better be important. Sir, it is, Eva said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. SEAL Team Trident is about to be wiped out in the Pike National Forest. The asset they're protecting, a civilian cryptographer, will be captured or killed. Conventional air support can't get to them. I can. Miller stepped into the frame, his face a thundercloud. General, I apologize for this intrusion. Captain, Rostova is not on flight status. She is acting against my direct orders. Thompson's gaze shifted from Eva to Miller, his eyes narrowing. Is what she says about the SEALs true, Colonel? Sir, the situation is critical, but this pilot. I didn't ask about the pilot, Thompson cut in, his voice dropping an octave. I asked about the SEALs. Are they about to be overrun? Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second. Yes, sir. Their last transmission confirmed it. Thompson looked back at Eva. And you believe you can provide effective close air support? Sir, I know I can, Eva said with unshakable certainty. My A-10 is the only platform that can handle that terrain, and I'm the only pilot on this base who knows it well enough to make a difference. I'm invoking Warfighter's Prerogative, Section 4, Paragraph 7b. A flicker of recognition crossed the general's face, followed by a slow, grim smile. He looked at Miller, whose jaw had gone slack with disbelief. Colonel, is there any other viable plan to save those men in the next 5 minutes? Miller was silent. He had no other plan. I didn't think so, Thompson said. He looked back at Eva, his eyes hard as diamonds. Captain Rostova, you have your authorization. Get my men out of there. And Valkyrie. Eva's breath caught in her throat. He had used her call sign. Not as a curse, but as a title. Yes, sir. Do not miss. The screen went blank. Eva stood up, her entire body thrumming with a purpose she hadn't felt in 2 years. She looked at Colonel Miller, whose face was a mixture of shock and fury. I'll need a ground crew, sir. And a co-pilot. Miller stared at her, the gears of bureaucracy grinding against the raw urgency of the moment. He had been overridden, his authority subverted. But he was also a soldier. He gave a single, sharp nod. You'll get them. But know this, Rostova. When you land, whether this works or not, you will face a court-martial. I'll take my chances, Eva said, already moving toward the door. The SEALs can't. The walk to the hangar was the longest of her life. Word had spread like wildfire. Airmen and crew chiefs stopped what they were doing, their faces a mixture of confusion and awe. They had all heard the stories about the legendary pilot who now worked in an office. Now, that ghost was walking among them again, her Warthog, tail. Number 78-0615 sat in the shadows of Hangar 3, just as she'd left it. It was an ugly, beautiful beast, covered in a thin layer of dust. Its nose was painted with the snarling teeth of a shark, a relic from a bygone era of air combat. To Eva, it was home. Her crew chief, a grizzled master sergeant named Pops who had been working on A-10 since they first rolled off the line, was already there, a look of fierce pride on his face. Knew you'd be back for her, Captain, he said, slapping the fuselage affectionately. Fuels topped off. Ammo's loaded. She's ready to bite. Thanks, Pops, Eva said, her voice thick with emotion. I need a pre-flight check done in 5 minutes. We'll do it in 3, he grinned as the ground crew swarmed the aircraft. A young lieutenant approached Eva, looking nervous and out of place. He was barely old enough to shave, and he had the wide-eyed look of someone who had only ever seen combat on a simulator. Captain Rostova? I'm Lieutenant Miller. You're co-pilot. Eva's heart sank. Miller. Of course. The colonel's son. It was a punishment, a babysitter, a spy in her cockpit. The kid was probably a hotshot who thought the A-10 belonged in a museum ever. Flown in a hog before, Lieutenant? Eva asked, her tone flat. No, he said, swallowing hard. I'm rated for the F-35. I've never even seen one of these up close. Perfect, Eva thought. She was going into a danger-close firefight with a novice who thought he was slumming it. All right, Miller. Listen up. There's no fancy computer in this cockpit. There's a stick, a throttle, and a whole lot of gauges. Your job is to watch my 6, manage communications, and call out any threats you see. You do exactly what I say, when I say it. You hesitate, you question me, and you'll get us both killed. Understood? Yes. He said, his face pale but his eyes determined. As Eva climbed the ladder into the cockpit, the familiar scent of hydraulic fluid and worn leather filled her senses. She strapped herself into the titanium bathtub that surrounded the pilot seat, a shell designed to withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft fire. Her hands moved with an instinct born of 1,000 flight hours, flipping switches, checking gauges. The plane came to life around her, its systems groaning and whirring like an old beast waking from a long slumber. Through her headset, she heard the tower. Valkyrie 7-8, you are cleared for immediate taxi and takeoff. Godspeed. She eased the throttles forward, and the Warthog began to rumble down the taxiway. The power of its twin engines was a physical presence, a deep vibration that resonated in her bones. She felt whole again, but as she lined up on the runway, ready to push the engines to their limit, a new voice cut through the comms. It was Colonel Miller, his tone laced with a strange, new urgency. Valkyrie, abort the takeoff. I say again, abort. That's a direct order. Eva's hand froze on the throttle. Abort. Now. They were seconds from being airborne. Command, be advised, I am on the runway, cleared for takeoff. What is the reason for the abort? There was a pause, a moment of static-filled hesitation. Then the colonel's voice came back, strained and heavy. We just got new intelligence. The asset the SEALs were protecting. It's not just a cryptographer. It's Dr. Aries Thorne. He's the lead architect of the entire Pentagon's defensive cyber network. And he's not alone. His daughter was with him. The first sons have them both. And they're not just militants, Eva. They are professionals. They knew exactly who they were grabbing. Eva's blood ran cold. This wasn't a random kidnapping. It was a targeted, military-grade operation. The stakes had just been raised exponentially. Colonel, that's more reason for me to go, not less. No. Miller's voice was sharp, almost frantic. You don't understand. We just got a signal from a tracker embedded on Thorne. It's faint, but it's moving. They're not holding position. They're transporting him. And their route, it's heading directly into Havenwood. Havenwood, the small, picturesque town nestled at the base of the mountains. Today was its annual Founders' Day festival. The town square would be packed with families, with children. The first sons weren't running. They were moving to a new battlefield, one filled with human shields. They're taking cover in a civilian population, Eva breathed, the horror of the situation washing over her. Exactly, Miller said. And we can't risk a firefight. In the middle of a festival. The potential for collateral damage is unacceptable. Stand down, Captain. We handle this on the ground now. Eva looked down the long, empty runway. Behind her, the base. Ahead of her, the sky. And beyond that, a town full of innocent people who were about to become pawns in a deadly game. Her orders were clear, stand down. But the image of that town square, the sound of children laughing, flashed in her mind. The first sons had chosen their ground carefully. They knew the military's hands would be tied by their own rules of engagement. They were counting on it, but they hadn't counted on her. They hadn't counted on a pilot who had already been to hell and back for making a tough call. They hadn't counted on the Valkyrie. Lieutenant Miller looked at her, his eyes wide with uncertainty. Captain, what are we going to do? Eva looked at the throttle, then back at the horizon. She could follow orders, save her career, and live with the knowledge that she did nothing. Or she could do what she was born to do. She pushed the throttles all the way forward. The Warthog screamed down the runway, pinning them both to their seats. We are going to break the rules, Lieutenant, she said into the MIC, her voice as hard as steel. And as the wheels left the ground, a new, chilling transmission came over the open channel, a voice she didn't recognize, calm and cold. Attention, Peterson Air Force Base. We have your asset. We know who is in the air. We suggest your Valkyrie stands down, unless she wants a repeat of Kandahar. The voice on the radio was like a ghost from her past, cold and mocking. It reached across the miles and into the sanctuary of her cockpit, turning her blood to ice. Unless she wants a repeat of Kandahar. They knew. They knew her history, her call sign, the one failure that had been hung around her neck like an anchor. This wasn't just a militia. This was an enemy with high-level intelligence. They weren't just trying to create chaos. They were trying to break her. Who the hell was that? Lieutenant Miller asked, his voice a half-octave higher than before. He was scanning the sky, his head on a swivel, as if expecting an enemy fighter to appear out of the clouds. That, Eva said, her knuckles white on the control stick, was the man in charge. And he just made this personal. She banked the A-10 hard, ignoring the protests of the airframe and the sharp intake of breath from her co-pilot. Colonel Miller was still shouting on the command frequency, ordering her to return to base, his words laced with threats of courts-martial and federal prison. Eva reached over and switched her comms to a secure, encrypted channel used only by special operations units. A channel she shouldn't have had access to, but one she had memorized years ago, just in case. Trident Actual, "This is Valkyrie 7 to 8. Do you copy?" she transmitted, her voice a low, urgent whisper. For a moment, there was only static. She imagined the SEALs, scattered, wounded, fighting a desperate retreat back toward the town. Had any of them even survived the initial onslaught? Then, a weak, strained voice came back. "Valkyrie. We read you. Barely. We thought. Command pulled you back." It was Marcus Thorne. He was alive. "Command doesn't always make the right call, Sergeant," Eva said, a grim smile touching her lips. "Give me a sit rep. What's your position and the status of the asset?" "Negative on the asset," Marcus coughed. They grabbed Thorne and his daughter. "We are down to 4 men, low on ammo, and trying to shadow them. They're moving fast, heading east along Boulder Creek, straight for Havenwood. They've got at least 20 men, maybe more. All ex-military, judging by their tactics. They knew our playbook before we did." "I'm on my way," Eva said. "Keep your heads down. I'm about 5 minutes out." She pushed the Warthog lower, dropping below the radar coverage of the nearby peaks. The ground rushed up to meet them, a blur of green and brown. She flew with an instinctual grace, her hands and feet dancing across the controls, guiding the 10-ton aircraft through the narrow canyons as if it were an extension of her own body. The A-10 wasn't built for speed, but for agility in tight spaces. It was a brawler, not a sprinter, and right now, Eva was flying it like a champion boxer, weaving and bobbing, hugging the terrain to stay invisible. Lieutenant Miller was holding on for dear life, his face a pale shade of green. But to his credit, he wasn't panicking. He was watching the instruments, his eyes scanning the threat display. Flying this low, we are blind. We have no radar, no eyes on what's ahead." "The radar is in my head, Lieutenant," Eva replied, her eyes fixed on the landscape ahead. "I've memorized every inch of this valley. The first sons are following the creek. It's the fastest route to Havenwood. But there's a choke point about 3 miles ahead. A place where the canyon narrows. It's called Diablo's Gate. They'll have to slow down there. That's where we hit them." It was a massive risk. If the enemy had anti-aircraft capabilities, flying into a narrow canyon was suicide. But it was the only chance they had to stop the convoy before it reached the town and its hundreds of civilian hostages. She was betting everything on the element. Of surprised as they neared Diablo's Gate, she saw them. 3 black, nondescript SUVs, moving fast along a dirt track that ran parallel to the creek. They were kicking up a cloud of dust, a clear sign against the green landscape. "I have eyes on the convoy," Eva said, her voice dropping into the calm, professional tone of a predator that has spotted its prey. 3 vehicles. I'm going to make a low pass, guns only. I'll target the lead and rear vehicles. Try to disable them, box them in. I need you to confirm no civilian presence. None." "Copy," Miller said, his voice shaky but focused. He leaned forward, his eyes glued to the targeting pod display, which gave them a magnified, thermal view of the ground below. "I see. The vehicles. Heat signatures confirm multiple occupants. No other vehicles on the road. The area appears clear." "All right," Eva breathed. "Hold on." She rolled the Warthog onto its side, dropping into the canyon like a hawk. The roar of the engines bounced off the granite walls, a deafening wave of sound that rolled ahead of them. The drivers of the SUVs heard it a second before they saw it. The lead vehicle swerved, the driver panicking. Too late, Eva lined up a shot, the crosshairs on her heads-up display glowing green. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon, the heart and soul of the Warthog, erupted. It wasn't the staccato pop of a machine gun. It was a deep, guttural roar, like the world was being torn in half. The cockpit vibrated violently as the 7-barreled cannon spat out 30mm depleted uranium shells at a rate of 70 per second. A stream of fire and death poured from the nose of the plane. The lead SUV disintegrated. It didn't explode. It was simply erased from existence, shredded into 1,000 pieces of twisted metal. Eva pulled back on the stick, climbing hard, the G-forces pressing her deep into her seat. She looped over the top of the canyon, rolling back in for a second pass on the rear vehicle. But as she came around, something was wrong. The third vehicle wasn't trying to flee. It had stopped. And on its roof, a hatch had opened. A man was standing there. a long tube resting on his shoulder, missile. Miller screamed. Man pads. 2 o'clock. Eva saw the puff of smoke, the streak of fire arcing toward them. She slammed the stick to the left, kicking the rudder hard. The A-10, for all its bulk, responded instantly, skidding sideways in the air. At the same time, she hit the countermeasures button, sending a shower of brilliant white flares out from the tail of the aircraft. The heat-seeking missile, confused by the sudden bloom of intense heat, veered off course, chasing a flare. Instead of their engine. It exploded harmlessly against the canyon wall, the concussion buffeting their plane like a giant hand. They were waiting for us, Eva said, her teeth clenched. It was a trap. They wanted us to engage. The middle SUV, the one carrying Dr. Thorne and his daughter, accelerated, weaving through the wreckage of the lead vehicle and speeding down the canyon. The third vehicle, its missile spent, opened up with a heavy machine gun mounted on its roof, streams of tracer fire reaching up for them like angry red fingers. They're trying to keep us occupied while the asset gets away, Miller said. His voice filled with a newfound respect. Your instincts were right, Captain. These guys are pros. They're about to find out what a pro can do, Eva growled. She ignored the machine gun fire, letting the bullets plink harmlessly off. The A-10's armored fuselage. She had bigger problems. The middle SUV was about to clear the canyon. Once it hit the open plains, it could be in Havenwood in minutes. She had one chance. She armed a Maverick missile, a precision-guided weapon that could hit a playing card from 2 miles away. But the rules of engagement were still screaming in her head. Do not risk the asset. A direct hit with a Maverick would vaporize the SUV and everyone in it. I can't use the missile, she said, thinking aloud. And the cannon will tear it to pieces. I need to stop it, not destroy it. She looked at the canyon walls, at the road, at the fleeing vehicle. An idea, born of desperation and a deep understanding of her weapon's capabilities, began to form in her mind. It was insane. It was reckless. And it was the only shot she had. Lieutenant, she said, her voice eerily calm. I'm going to make another gun run. But I'm not aiming for the truck. Miller looked at her, confused. What are you aiming for? The road in front of it, she said. I'm going to use the cannon to dig a trench. A very big trench. She rolled in, diving lower than she ever had before. The ground rushed up at them, the pine trees so close she felt like she could reach out and touch them. The machine gun fire from the rear vehicle was more intense now, a storm of lead hammering against their wings and belly. A warning light flashed on her console. A hydraulic line had been hit. The plane was bleeding, but it wasn't dead. Not yet. She ignored the warnings, her focus absolute. She lined up the shot, placing the Pipper on the dirt road about 50 yards in front of the speeding SUV. She squeezed the trigger for a full 2-second burst. The cannon roared. The ground in front of the SUV erupted in a cataclysmic explosion of dirt, rock, and fire. The 30mm shells, designed to tear through tank armor, hit the ground and chewed a crater 10 feet deep and 20 feet wide. The driver of the SUV, faced with a suddenly impassable chasm, slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just inches from the edge. They were trapped. Eva pulled up, a surge of triumph flowing through her. But it was short-lived. As she climbed, her plane shuddering from the damage, a new warning tone blared in the cockpit. It was a sound she hadn't heard since Kandahar. It was the high-pitched, terrifying squeal of a radar lock. Not a simple manpads, but a sophisticated, vehicle-mounted surface-to-air missile system radar lock. Radar lock. Miller shouted, his eyes wide with terror. Where did that come from? On the ridge overlooking the canyon, a place they hadn't even thought to check, a third element of the First Sons team had been waiting. A truck, camouflaged with netting, had dropped its sides, revealing a fully operational missile launcher, its radar dish pointed directly at them. They had been so focused on the convoy in the canyon, they had flown right into the jaws of the real trap. The voice of the enemy leader crackled over the radio again, laced with triumphant venom. You fly a relic from a forgotten war, Valkyrie. It's time you joined it in the scrapyard. A plume of white smoke erupted from the ridge. The missile was in the air. And this time, there were no flares that could save them. The missile tore through the sky, a white spear aimed at the heart of the Warthog. There was no time to think, only to react. Eva slammed the control stick forward and to the right, throwing. the A-10 into a violent dive, a maneuver that defied the plane's very design. The airframe screamed in protest, the metal groaning under the immense G-forces. Her vision tunneled, the world turning grey at the edges as the blood rushed from her head. "Chaff! Deploy chaff!" she yelled, her voice strained. Lieutenant Miller, his training kicking in despite the terror, mashed the countermeasures button. The aircraft ejected a cloud of tiny aluminum strips, a glittering, ghost-like image of the plane designed to fool the missile's radar. For a heart-stopping second, the missile continued on its course, a relentless predator. Then, at the last possible moment, it veered, fooled by the electronic mirage. It shot past their cockpit, so close Eva could see the fins on its tail, and exploded against the far canyon wall in a deafening blast of fire and shrapnel. The shockwave hit them like a physical blow, tossing the heavy plane as if it were a leaf in the wind. Alarms blared across the console. The right engine was on fire, and the damaged hydraulic line had ruptured completely. The control stick felt loose and sluggish in her hands, like she was trying to steer a ship with a broken rudder. Right engine is out. We are losing hydraulic pressure fast. Miller shouted over the cacophony of alarms. "We have to eject." "No." Eva grunted, fighting the controls. "If we eject, they get Thorn. We are not leaving." She was flying a crippled beast, a wounded animal, but it was still flying. She leveled out, hugging the canyon floor, using the terrain to shield them from the missile launcher on the ridge. The remaining left engine roared in protest, straining to keep them airborne. Every instinct told her to climb, to run for the safety of altitude. But she couldn't. The launcher was still up there, waiting for them to show themselves. And the SEALs and the trapped SUV were still down here. "Valkyrie, what's your status?" Marcus Thorne's voice crackled over the comms, filled with anxiety. "We saw the explosion. Are you hit?" "We are still in the fight, Trident," Eva replied, her voice tight with effort. "The convoy is stopped at Diablo's gate. The asset is in the middle vehicle, but they've got a SAM site on the North Ridge. We are pinned down here as much as you are." She could see the situation on the ground. The First Sons from the rear vehicle were setting up a defensive perimeter around the SUV holding the Thorns, using the disabled truck as cover. They were dug in, waiting for the SEALs to attack. On the other side of the man-made crater, Sergeant Thorne and his 3 remaining men were taking cover, hopelessly outgunned. It was a stalemate. A deadly, ticking stalemate. Because sooner or later, that missile launcher on the ridge would reload. "We need to take out that launcher," Eva said, more to herself than to Miller. "How?" Miller asked, his voice betraying his doubt. "We can't get a missile lock from down here, and if we pop up, they'll nail us." Eva's mind raced, processing 1,000 variables at once. The plane's damage, the fuel level, the remaining ammunition, the terrain. The Warthog was tough. It was designed to take a beating and keep flying. But it wasn't invincible. The fire in the right engine was getting worse, a trail of black smoke now pouring from the nacelle. They had minutes, maybe less, before they would lose control completely. Then, an idea sparked. A crazy, desperate, 1-in-a-million plan. The A-10 had another name, a nickname given to it by the infantrymen it was designed to protect, the Tank Buster. Its cannon wasn't just for hitting targets directly. The sheer force of the 30mm rounds was legendary. "Trident," Eva said into the comms. "I have a plan, but it's going to get loud. I need you to do exactly as I say. On my signal, I want you to lay down suppressing fire on the enemy position. Don't try to hit them, just make them keep their heads down. Can you do that?" "We've got maybe 2 mags left between us, Valkyrie," Marcus replied. "But we'll make M count. What's the signal?" "You'll know it when you hear it," Eva said. She turned to Miller. "Lieutenant, I need you to trust me. I'm going to fly us straight at the north wall of the canyon. It's going to feel like we are going to crash. We are not. I hope." Before he could protest, she banked the crippled plane, lining it up with the sheer granite cliff face. She was flying perpendicular to the battle on the ground, presenting the missile launcher on the ridge with the smallest possible target. She pushed the throttle of the good engine to its maximum, accelerating toward the wall of rock. "Captain, this is insane." Miller yelled, his hands gripping the side of his seat. "The missile launcher is on the ridge above us. Eva explained, her eyes darting between the cliff face and her instruments. They're expecting us to climb. They're not expecting us to use the canyon itself as a weapon. The granite wall filled their entire windscreen. They were seconds from impact. The ground proximity alarm screamed its electronic terror now. Eva shouted she didn't pull up. Instead, she fired the GAU-8. Not at an enemy, but at the base of the cliff. The cannon roared, and the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The depleted uranium shells, traveling at nearly the speed of sound, slammed into the ancient rock. The granite, weakened by millennia of fractures and fissures, shattered. The entire base of the cliff exploded outward. A wave of concussive force and razor-sharp rock fragments ripped up the side of the canyon. The missile launcher, the truck, and the men operating it were not hit by a single bullet. They were hit by a mountain. The landslide, a man-made avalanche of rock and fury, swept over the ridge, scouring it clean. The SAM site vanished under tons of granite and earth on the ground. The SEALs and the First Sons alike stared in stunned silence as the entire northern face of the canyon collapsed. The roar was biblical, the ground shaking as if from an earthquake. Marcus Thorne knew the signal. "Fire!" he yelled, and the last of the SEALs' ammunition ripped through the air, forcing the stunned militants to duck back behind their cover. Die in the cockpit. Eva was fighting for their lives. The recoil from the cannon and the shockwave from the landslide had nearly sent them into a fatal spin. She wrestled with the controls, her muscles screaming in protest. The plane, mortally wounded, was barely responding. "We are losing her," Miller said, his voice grim. "Not yet," Eva grunted. She managed to level out, the plane limping through the air, trailing a thick plume of smoke. They had done it. They had taken out the primary threat. But now, they were a sitting duck. And the enemy leader knew it. His voice, filled with a mixture of fury and disbelief, came over the radio. "You crazy witch. You think that saves you?" Eva looked down. The First Sons, recovering from their shock, were regrouping. One of them was setting up a tripod, mounting a heavy weapon, a .50 caliber machine gun. It wouldn't take the plane down, but it could certainly tear through the cockpit canopy, and then she saw it. A new, more terrifying threat. The leader himself was walking toward the SUV holding the thorns. He wasn't carrying a rifle. He was carrying a demolition charge with a timer. He placed it on the roof of the SUV, his movements calm and deliberate. He looked up, his eyes seeming to bore right into Eva's, even from a mile away. He keyed his radio. "You have a choice, Valkyrie," the cold voice said. "You can fly away and save yourselves. Or you can stay and watch. You have 60 seconds to clear the airspace. After that, your precious asset and his daughter will be nothing but a memory. The clock is ticking." The red numbers on the timer began to count down. 59, 58, 57. Eva stared at the timer on her targeting pod display. 60 seconds. Not enough time to circle around. Not enough time for the SEALs to cross the open ground. Not enough time for a miracle. Her plane was falling apart. Her right engine was a ball of fire. Her controls were failing. Every rational thought screamed at her to obey her own survival instinct and fly away. But she wasn't just a pilot. She was a shield. And she would not break. "Trident," she said, her voice a low, dangerous growl. "Get ready to move." She turned to Miller, a fire in her eyes that burned brighter than the flames on her engine. "Lieutenant, strap in. We are going back. Down." "Captain, we can't," he pleaded. "The plane won't take it. We have no hydraulics, one engine, and a fire. We'll crash." "We are not going to crash," Eva said, her hands already pushing the stick forward, tipping the nose of the dying Warthog toward the canyon floor one last time. "We are going to land." The countdown continued. 45, 44, 43. The ground rushed toward them, not as a target, but as a runway. A runway from hell. The idea was pure madness. A belly landing in a rocky, uneven canyon, in a plane that was on fire and actively trying to fall out of the sky. It wasn't in any flight manual. It was a maneuver born of sheer, unyielding desperation. "Lieutenant." Miller was reciting the Lord's Prayer under his breath, his eyes squeezed shut. But Eva was preternaturally calm. The chaos outside the cockpit seemed to fade away, replaced by a singular, crystalline focus. She saw the numbers on the timer ticking down. 32. 31. She saw the enemy leader standing by the SUV, a triumphant smirk on his face. She saw the faces of the SEALs, waiting for her move. Trident, this is Valkyrie, she said into the comms, her voice as steady as a surgeon's hand. On my mark, you advance. Do not stop. Do not hesitate. Take the asset and get out. Valkyrie, what are you doing? Marcus Thorne's voice was filled with disbelief. You're not. Just be ready to run, Sergeant. Eva cut him off. She killed the last engine. The roar that had been her constant companion vanished, replaced by an eerie, whistling silence as the Warthog became a 10-ton glider. The only sounds were the screaming of the wind and the frantic beeping of a dozen dying systems. She had to conserve every last drop of hydraulic pressure for one final, critical maneuver. The ground came up fast. She wasn't aiming for the dirt track, but for the shallow, rocky creek bed beside it. The water would help cool the fuselage and slow them down, hopefully without ripping them to shreds. 20. 19. 18. Get ready, she whispered. She pulled back on the stick with all her might, using the last of the hydraulics to flare the nose up to soften the impact. For a fraction of a second, the A-10 leveled out, skimming just feet above the rocks. Then they hit. The impact was cataclysmic. A sound of tearing, screaming metal filled the world. The armored belly of the Warthog slammed into the creek bed, sending a shower of sparks and shattered rock in all directions. The plane bucked and slewed sideways, the left wing clipping a boulder and shearing off with a deafening groan. They were a metal comet, a storm of destruction, plowing a furrow through the canyon floor. Inside the cockpit, Eva and Miller were thrown violently against their harnesses, their heads snapping back. The titanium bathtub did its job, protecting them from the worst of the impact, but the force was still bone-jarring. The enemy leader, who had been watching the sky, stared in utter shock as the burning plane, which he assumed was fleeing, instead came crashing down directly toward his position. He had planned for every contingency except one, a pilot who valued her mission more than her own life. 10. 9. 8. The Warthog, now a wingless, sliding wreck, was a battering ram of vengeance. It slammed into the rear enemy vehicle, the one with the .50 caliber gun, obliterating it in a tangle of steel. The momentum carried it forward, spinning it around. The tail of the aircraft, heavy and solid, swung like a giant's club and smashed into the militants who were clustered for defense. Panic erupted. The disciplined soldiers of the First Sons broke and ran, scattering before the unpredictable, terrifying onslaught of the crashing plane. Now, Trident. Go, go, go. Eva screamed into the MIC. Marcus Thorne and his men didn't need to be told twice. As the militants scattered, they broke cover, sprinting across the open ground toward the SUV, their rifles blazing. The enemy leader, snapping out of his shock, saw the SEALs coming. He turned from the wreck and sprinted for the detonator, which he had left on a nearby rock. 5. 4. 3. He was almost there. His fingers were inches from the button, but he never made it. The Warthog, its forward momentum finally spent, slid to a halt. Its nose, painted with the snarling shark's teeth, was now just feet from the SUV. And that nose held one last surprise. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon, though powerless, was still intact. And it was pointed directly at him. The leader froze, his eyes locking with the 7 black barrels of the cannon. It was the last thing he ever saw. The heat from the crash had cooked off a single, remaining 30mm round in the chamber. With a deafening roar, the cannon fired one last, defiant shot. The shell ripped through the enemy leader, and he simply ceased to exist. The timer hit 0. But with the detonator's master controller destroyed, the charge was inert. It was over. Silence descended on the canyon, broken only by the crackle of flames from the Warthog's ruined engine and the hiss of hot metal in the creek water. The SEALs had secured Dr. Thorne and his daughter, who were shaken but unharmed. The remaining handful of militants had thrown down their weapons, their will to fight broken. Inside the cockpit, Eva's adrenaline finally gave way to a wave of bone-deep exhaustion. She slumped in her seat, every muscle in her body aching. She looked over at Miller. He was pale and trembling, but he was alive. He looked back at her, his eyes filled with a reverence that bordered on worship. I don't believe it, he stammered. No one's ever done that. No one. Eva gave a weak smile. She unstrapped herself, the release buckle clicking loudly in the sudden quiet. She pushed open the canopy, which was cracked but still functional. The smell of smoke, pine, and victory filled her lungs. It was the best smell in the world. She climbed out of the wreck, her legs shaky, and dropped to the ground. Her plane, her beautiful, ugly, faithful Warthog, was a ruin. It had given its life to save theirs. She placed a hand on its scorched fuselage, a silent thank you to an old friend. Marcus Thorne approached her, his face streaked with grime, his uniform torn. He stopped in front of her and, without a word, rendered a sharp, perfect salute. The other 3 SEALs followed his lead. Dr. Thorne, holding his daughter's hand, simply nodded, his eyes shining with a gratitude too profound for words ours. Later, back at Peterson, the scene was surreal. A fleet of helicopters had extracted everyone from the canyon. The base was buzzing, not with mockery, but with a hushed, reverent awe. As Eva walked across the tarmac toward the debriefing room, airmen stopped and stared. They weren't looking at grounded Goose. They were looking at the Valkyrie. She opened the door to the briefing room. It was filled with brass. General Thompson stood in the center, alongside a grim-faced Colonel Miller. Major Jensen, the cocky F-35 pilot, stood in the corner, looking. Small and insignificant, Eva braced herself for the storm, for the court-martial Miller had promised. She had disobeyed direct orders, destroyed a multi-million-dollar aircraft, and single-handedly rewritten the rules of engagement. Colonel Miller stepped forward. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He opened his mouth, and Eva prepared. For the worst, Captain Rostova, he began, his voice formal. He cleared his throat. I have reviewed the gun camera footage, the communications logs, and the statements from SEAL Team Trident. I have also received a direct call from the Secretary of Defense. He paused, and Eva's heart pounded in her chest. It is my duty to inform you, Miller continued, a strange light entering his eyes, that your actions today, while unorthodox, were instrumental in saving the lives of 7 American citizens, including 4 special operators, and preventing a national security disaster of the highest order. The charges of insubordination are being dropped. A collective sigh of relief went through the room. But Miller wasn't finished. He looked over at Major Jensen, then back at Eva. Furthermore, it has become clear that the A-10 platform and pilots with your unique skill set are an irreplaceable asset. Effective immediately, you are reinstated to full flight status. You are being given command of a new, reactivated A-10 squadron to be based here at Peterson. You will write the training doctrine. You will choose your pilots. You will teach them how to do what you do. Eva was speechless. It was more than she could have ever hoped for. It wasn't just a pardon, it was a vindication. General Thompson stepped forward, a warm smile on his face. He unpinned the silver eagle from his own collar and pinned it onto Eva's. Congratulations, Colonel Rostova. The promotion was a shock, but the deepest satisfaction came from something else. As the room erupted in applause, she looked past the generals, past the other officers, to Major Jensen. He met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no smirk, no mockery in his eyes. There was only one thing, respect. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. Later that evening, Eva stood alone in the now empty Hangar 3, staring at the vacant space, where her Warthog used to be. They would never be able to repair it. But it hadn't died in vain. A new squadron of hogs would soon fill this hangar, their shark-toothed snouts ready for the next fight. Her fight was over, but a new one was just beginning. A voice from the doorway made her turn. It was Marcus Thorne. They told me I might find you here, he said. He held out a small, blackened piece of metal. I found this in the wreckage. Thought you might want it. It was a piece of the fuselage from just under the cockpit, a fragment of the shark's mouth, scorched but still snarling. Eva took it, her fingers closing around the warm metal. Thank you, Sergeant. No, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. We were out of ammo. We were out of time. And then we heard you. He paused, looking at her with an intensity that made her feel 10 feet tall. You're the angel we pray for, the one with the 7-barreled roar. He saluted and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. She looked at the piece of her fallen plane, a symbol of her past, and then looked out at the runway, a symbol of her future. The ghosts of Kandahar were finally silent. She was no longer a liability. She was a legend. And she was home.